Hello and welcome to the webinar. I'm Dr. Janice Baker, and today I'm going to be talking about the effects of tactical gear on working dog performance. So to start out with, what this webinar is not going to do is push or promote any certain products or brands over any others. Now we might show you a brand and say that this is something that's commonly used or that we've used it and we like it, but we're not going to promote any one product over another product. This is not a sales pitch. What we are going to do is talk about the scientific evidence behind how the most common gear that's used in working dogs can affect their physical or behavioral performance. And to be honest, there's not a lot of evidence out there, but what is out there, we've dug up and we've really studied, and so we're going to discuss that with you today. So you, as a canine trainer or handler or veterinarian, can make the best decisions for the dog or the dogs that you work with. So to start, we're just going to go over an overview of what tactical gear is and why do we call it tactical? That term used to have a specific meaning. Now it gets thrown out there for anything that's OD green or coyote tan or multicam. Now it's tactical. You can go just do an internet search for tactical canine vests and you'll see pictures of like little purse dogs wearing some kind of vest, and it's also become very popular in the service dog industry, so to speak, that they, instead of just wearing a regular vest, civilian style vest, now I see a lot of these service dogs. Whether they're legit service dogs or not, that's another story. But a lot of these service dogs that have some sort of what would normally be used as a tactical vest or harness on a working dog. So that term tactical has really been diluted out. But in general, what it means is it's purpose constructed, wearable, or carried gear. So it's not just purpose like I need it to control the dog, to take the dog on a walk. It's purpose constructed to do a certain operational or tactical mission. And in general, it serves two main functions. One is to protect the dog, and the other is to enhance the capability of whatever your mission is. So whether it's some kind of protective gear like ballistic vest or eyewear or ear pro, or if it's something that just helps with mobility of the dog, being able to pick the dog, hoist the dog, control the dog a little bit better, or load bearing carrying gear like the camera that's seen in this picture or the vest worn cameras. And there's an unfortunate effect that I've already kind of touched on, is that, the big unfortunate effect is that the need for this gear is often extrapolated from human requirements. We all know the big thing with tourniquets. The evidence says that dogs don't really need tourniquets to control bleeding in the extremities, with some rare exceptions. But it's the need for tourniquets in the human medical world or the human tactical world is so emphasized that that's trickled down into the canine world. And no matter how many times you show people the evidence and say, look, there's no need for tourniquets, or there's little need for tourniquets, you can just use an ace wrap for that, they'll still push tourniquets and buy tourniquets and sell tourniquets and all that stuff. So the need, again, is often extrapolated from human requirements. If we're doing this for the body armor, for example, if we're doing this for the officers or the canine handlers, we should be doing it for the dogs because they're just as important. And that's a reasonable thought. The problem there is that if something's just extrapolated from the human use into canine use, it's rarely actually tested for the efficacy on dogs. And canine body armor is an example for this. The materials are tested at some other level for human use, but once a company puts together the actual body armor, that's not really tested for efficacy in any way that requires oversight from a larger body. And a lot of the things that we use for dogs are cast off products from human use. And this is especially true in the medical realm, which this is not a medical discussion today, although we'll mention it a couple times, but especially medical. When a product is developed en masse with hopes to getting a big contract like with the military for human use, say a certain kind of tourniquet, or years ago, there was a thing like this with these handheld blood analyzers that were made for humans, and we bought several to send on deployment for canine, just to find out that the ones that we bought, the very expensive things that we bought for canine use, were actually the discontinued human model from a couple years before. And that just was infuriating because the human, it's all human. You have to use it on dogs and then do some calculations to adjust for dogs. But what these were the models that they still had in stock that they couldn't get on their shelves because they'd moved on to a new model. And what they did is basically figuratively stamp a dog paw on it, a dog endorsement on it, and sell it to veterinarians instead, which is just infuriating. But that happens a lot. The first type of equipment we're going to talk about are muzzles. We all know that the main function of muzzles are the safety of people, so to prevent biting. And what's not listed here is training. So we do a lot of muzzle training, but that falls under it's preventing the dog from biting the decoy or biting anybody. And we know I'm not a dog trainer, so I won't try to explain it. But those of you who do use muzzles for training and veterinarians who aren't familiar with it, they'll put a muzzle on the dog and have the dog apprehend or go after the decoy, and it prevents them from biting, and it also um, sort of encourages the dog to use their whole body and other means to apprehend the subject. So secondary functions: prevention of eating or dietary indiscretion, getting into their bedding and ripping it up, or if the dog's on dietary restrictions for any reason. And then also prevention of chewing or self-harm, especially with bandages or any kind of medical treatment. Now, and there's a lot of other uses that aren't listed here, just depending on the type of dog. But the main problem with muzzles is that they prevent normal and adequate panting. Almost every style of muzzle does this. That what we'll go on to in the next slide. But regardless of the style of muzzle, with the exception of one style, it doesn't allow the mouth to open or the tongue to hang out appropriately to pant adequately. For some dogs, it's a behavioral trigger. You put on the muzzle, they know they're going to work, and so there's kind of this dilemma when you go to the vet. The vet wants a muzzle on the dog, but that also cues the dog that the dog's about to get to go after somebody, and so that's you have to work with your veterinarian, and you as the dog trainer or handler have to come up with alternatives that if your dog is really cued up by the muzzle, different kinds of muzzles or different kinds of restraint. And we'll leave that up to you what you do. There's no one size fits all for every dog. Another problem with muzzles, especially the faceplate style muzzles like the the Ray Allen muzzles and some of the other ones that we call them faceplate muzzles that have a sort of a solid closure, is, or any of them actually, because that keeps the mouth shut. If a dog is sick and you're using it to prevent injury, because the guidelines say always muzzle the dog, and then the dog for whatever reason vomits, that traps that vomit, doesn't allow it to leave the mouth as easily, and they can have potential aspiration, which means that vomitus and other material goes down into their lungs instead. So if the dog is sick or getting veterinary treatment, there's another dilemma, because the guidelines seem to be, and we'll discuss that further, but the guidelines seem to be always muzzle the dog. But now you've got this situation where the dog needs to vomit, and that could just imagine putting a pillow over your face and vomiting, and where's all that vomit going to go? It gets, if the dog can't open their mouth and expel their tongue appropriately, it gets trapped in their mouth and potentially aspirated. Now, if you look at all of these muzzles, all four of these styles, none of them allow the dog to adequately hang their tongue out or open their mouth very widely. Now, that wire muzzle that's on the right, the tongue can probably hang out quite a bit, but it doesn't allow the jaw to open. The mesh muzzle on the little Labrador there doesn't allow the mouth to open at all. And even if they could squeeze their tongue out between their incisors and their canines, that would probably cause damage to their tongue. That the mesh muzzle, moving from the right to the left, that leather mesh muzzle, you can see the tongue's hanging out a little bit and the mouth is pretty wide, but I can guarantee that that mouth still isn't as wide as it should be, and the tongue isn't hanging out as far as it needs to be to effectively cool. And then that faceplate style muzzle there on the poor dog with the paw injuries, that muzzle is actually pretty small on him. He can't hang his tongue out at all, and he also can't open his mouth widely, very much at all. So all four of those muzzles would seriously contribute to overheating if the dog was agitated and wearing that muzzle. So there really isn't a lot of publicly available information on the effects of canine muzzles on thermoregulation. There was a study about 10 years ago in working dogs in the military. The dogs ran on a treadmill for 15 minutes wearing different kinds of muzzles. And we clearly saw in every case that if a dog was wearing a muzzle, his temperature was significantly increased to a clinical concern. So obviously they didn't run the dogs until they had heat injury. They just ran them until we saw a significant rise in their temperature. But because it's military, those studies don't always get published in the open journals for people to see. Sometimes they do the studies and turn that information to the military, and the military stores that information. But but that's what we saw. We clearly saw a rise in temperature, and it didn't matter what kind of muzzle they were using. Now, the one thing that wasn't available at the time was the adjustable muzzles that we'll talk about here in just a second. They were all of the wire muzzles, the leather mesh muzzles, or the leather faceplate style muzzles. And there's one study that's a survey of owner perceptions of muzzles on their dogs, and 15% of the people in that study said that they had noted that their dog overheated or got too hot when he was wearing a muzzle, and that was a significant concern for them. Our recommendations for muzzles then are first and foremost, use them judiciously and cautiously. The guidelines in most of the canine TCCC or tech guidelines, a lot of them will start out with always muzzle the dog. And we know that terms like always and never, we have to really approach those with caution in the first place. But we think that this is a dangerous statement to make in the medical guidelines. Now, we're not negating the importance of protecting people and the fact that these dogs are not pets and a lot of them will bite, or any dog will bite if provoked enough. But we're not negating that. What we're saying is when it says always muzzle the dog, like first of all, we know if it's anything says always or never, you have to approach that with caution. But always muzzle the dog is starts out a lot of the canine TCCC or tech guidelines, and then it's not until you get into the weeds later in respiratory that it says, oh yeah, unless the dog is got an injury to the chest, or unless the dog needs to pant to get more oxygen, or unless the dog, then don't muzzle him. And that's really confusing. If you always muzzle the dog but you don't under these conditions, then it's not always, right? So I think that as veterinarians, this especially veterinarians are guilty of this. Um, as veterinarians or veterinary technicians who are teaching handlers, we have to get rid of that term always, and we should say consider muzzling the dog, or muzzle the dog unless there's a reason not to, and these are the reasons. It has to be said right up front. Don't say always muzzle the dog and then wait for 4 pages later to say the exceptions of when you wouldn't muzzle the dog. It's a dangerous statement if it's left as it is. And remove the muzzle whenever it's safe to allow effective panning for thermoregulation or cooling. So the dilemma is if you're doing some kind of public event where the dog's out in public, and by policy of your organization, you're required to have the dog in a muzzle. But the dog's excited and agitated and it's a hot day and he really needs to have that muzzle off to be able to pant effectively. Another thing where we've seen this is in Afghanistan and Iraq, a lot of the flight crews said that if a dog was going to be on the helicopter or the airplane, they had to be muzzled. So we're flying at less than 1,000 feet, between like 800 and 1,000 feet. It's super hot at that elevation. It's hotter than it's on the ground. You're in the back of this rattly, oily, smelly helicopter, and the dog is agitated because they know something's going on. They know you're on your way to something, and they're required to have a muzzle, and they're practically overheated by the time they get there. They're just smoked. When you take the muzzle off and go to work, they're not in the mood because they're on the borderline of being overheated. So really have to watch out for that. Take it off whenever it's possible, whenever it's safe for humans to allow that effective panning. And then the adjustable muzzles that I mentioned before, we really recommend those. So I'm not trying to recommend any specific brand, but I will say that the DA Canine one that's pictured there in both of those photos, the photo on the left and the middle, that was the first one that we knew about, and we were absolutely thrilled when that came out. Now there's multiple brands that are out there. If you just go on an internet search and type in adjustable canine muzzle, you'll see all sorts of different kinds. They're being sold and promoted to regular veterinary clinics, which is great. That's absolutely great. It's great how things will trickle down from the tactical world to the civilian world, and this is no exception. And there's the adjustable muzzle on the far right there. There's a bunch of other off brands and weird brands. You can get them in any color, including multicam, so you'll stay tactical while being safe. Um, but these are great because they're lightweight. They're really easy to carry. You can fold them up, put them in a pocket, or even on the dog's gear somewhere. They allow the mouth to be completely wide open and the tongue to hang out, and that is effective cooling and safe handling at the same time. And one of the hallmarks of both of these muzzles, that's really cool, is that they're longer than normal cloth muzzles, so longer in length from the jaw to the snout, basically. If you look at the gray muzzle on the right, which is an old prototype of the DA canine muzzle, the cloth part hangs down in front of the canines. So that, although that one's not extended as wide as it could be, it's actually cinched down pretty tightly. If you extend that wide open, the dog can drop his jaw into a normal position to pant. They can hang their tongue out. But if the dog were to suddenly snap around, you do something that pisses the dog off and he snaps around and tries to bite you, he's going to bump you with the side of his canines, or you might get caught in the incisors, which isn't quite as bad as a canine. So it still protects you, gives you that extra second to get away if they snap their head around and try to bite. As long as your fingers aren't actually in the front of the mouth, you're going to stay pretty safe. And then when you're going to do something that clearly is going to make the dog mad, then you cinch that down all the way with their tongue inside their mouth, and you do the thing that you need to do, and then you immediately release it so they can drop their mouth open again. We love that kind of muzzle. The adjustable muzzles are one of the, in my opinion, one of the greatest inventions in veterinary medicine in a long, long time. The next type of equipment we'll talk about are the tactical vests, meaning the non-ballistic protective vests. And their main functions are for control and movement of the dog, including hoisting, and then load bearing or carrying certain kinds of equipment like cameras or other sorts of packs, depending on the use of the dog. So there is scientific evidence that these types of vests do restrict range of motion of the dog. And this is going to go for harnesses as well. And there's these big full vests, and then there's the really slim harnesses, and then there's a lot of kinds of vest harnesses, sort of hybrids in between, where they might cover the back, but then straps over under the belly, or they might cover the shoulders and the back, but with just straps over the belly. There's all sorts of, it's kind of like a gradient between a vest and a harness. But all of them restrict range of motion to some degree in a handful of studies. There's maybe 5 studies total on this, between the harnesses and the vests. The good thing is there's no elevation in the body temperature. And in that same study that I talked about, where they studied the effects of muzzles on thermoregulation and body temperature, they also looked at tactical vests and and body armor as well. And there was no elevation in the body temperature when they were wearing this kind of vest. There's another study that was a graduate thesis that's available, and it's listed in the references, that showed that with these vests, there also was no elevation in body temperature. And in some cases, like when the dogs were in direct sunlight, the body temperature actually stayed lower when they were working while they were wearing the vest. And we think it was sort of like a sunscreen screen. It was deflecting the solar radiation or the solar heat coming into the dog's body. So, but we're not saying that they're protective against heat injury. What we're saying is it wasn't really significant, but there was a trend for the dogs wearing the vest to actually be a little bit cooler when they were working in direct sunlight, which is kind of interesting. But no elevation in body temperature, not like us where we wear a big jacket or anything that will increase our body temperature. They have no effect on that. And we do recommend that they're custom fitted due to the different proportions of the body to limb position. So all dogs are shaped differently. You see that dog in the middle, he's wearing the vest that has the straps that go around the rear legs, and that's, I'm presuming, is for some kind of hoist operation. But he's got a long, short body. And then that shepherd, he's sitting down, so it's not as easy to see how long he is, but you can see the vest in the Malinois that's standing up. It only goes to right to the back of his rib cage. You can see his one of his last ribs sticking out below, and then the shepherd that um, is wearing that multicam vest, extends farther back onto his body. Now that just could be the type of vest, the brand of vest, but the the sort of the proportions of the holes of the legs versus the body length and all of that, that can get that can get way off. It's just like clothes on humans. Some people are tall, people are wide, they have longer arms, whatnot. So we do recommend custom fitting just because the different proportions of the body to limb position. There are a lot of vests out there. Look, when we searched for what's available online, um, there's a lot of vests out there that they're under $100, and the really good vests we know cost a lot more than that, and so they're not custom fitted. They're just you know small, medium, and large sort of things that are stamped out and mass produced, and it's not going to fit every dog. So these, because they do affect range of motion, they can cause a lot of wear and tear on the skin. They can cause hot spots. They can decrease the agility of the dog being able to run. And if the dog gets sore because they're wearing a vest that's too tight or is rubbing in a certain place, that's going to reduce the dog's ability to work, or willingness to work even further. And then one thing you'll notice there is we did give a photo credit whenever possible. Again, we're not trying to endorse any specific product, but a lot of these things that we wanted to show the examples, we just didn't have good photos of it ourselves, so we went online and found these photos. So we're going to give a photo credit whenever possible, and you can assume that if there's no photo credit, we probably took the photo ourselves, or we've some of these photos, we've just had them so long we don't remember where we got them. Did I take the photo? Is that from a product? I don't remember. But most of these we're going to give a photo credit, and also that way, if you do want to track down that product, if you like what you see, then we give you the source for that. All right, the next thing we're going to talk about are harnesses, and the main function of the harnesses, just like the vests, control and moving the dog. They do sometimes have some load bearing. You can put cameras or other things on them, but for the most part, it's mostly control and moving the dog, a little bit less with the equipment carry. And the studies that I mentioned before on the vests and the harnesses, they apply here. Different harnesses impair stride length, weight distribution of the body where their feet land, and actually side to side spinal movement in different ways. And this was found in different breeds. So several different studies in this, and one specific study showed that there was the Y-shaped harnesses that's shown in the photo on the left, and then the chest strap style that's shown on the right. And in larger breeds like Labradors, the Y-shaped harness restricted those dogs more, and they were doing motion capture analysis, which is really cool. I like that kind of stuff. So motion capture analysis and kinematics showing that being able to calculate the length of stride and the movement in the joints when they do their foot strike, the impact to the ground, and how much the joints compress or flex and extend, which is pretty cool stuff. But they found that in larger dogs like Labradors in that study, the Y-shaped harnesses were more restrictive than the chest strap style. But the smaller the dogs got, the chest strap style affected them more. And interestingly, these weren't in working dogs. These were all different breeds of dogs. Interesting, in pit bull dogs, those dogs didn't care what kind of strap they had on or what kind of harness. It didn't affect their stride at all. And that's pretty fascinating. Is that because they're so muscular? Is it because of the shape of their body? I have no idea. They didn't go into that detail. But the bottom line to that is all of these different studies showed different things. Some of them compared the type of harness. Some of them all were the same kind of harness, but they moved differently. One of them that was looking at vests and harnesses actually found that if the vest was custom fitted to the dog, it restricted motion more than if it wasn't. And that they didn't really get to go into a lot of detail on that, but that might have been because if it's custom fitted, it fits. Think of like slim fitting clothes or tailored clothes versus off the rack clothes, where there's a little bit more movement to move around inside of it. And they didn't really go into details of that, but that's one possibility. I just thought that was interesting. And they didn't really describe custom fitted. That was just, they just measured the dog and made the vest for the or adjusted the straps for the dog versus sort of an off the rack small, medium, and large type vests. Pretty interesting. So since there's so much different information and none of these studies repeated each other, they all looked at different things. So the bottom line to this for the harnesses and the vest is fit the harness to the dog. Now the motion capture analysis is really cool, but it's expensive and impractical. There are a couple of labs, universities that can do this, but it's again, it's really expensive, it's really impractical, and you can't really do it while the dog's doing like apprehension work, or it's mostly trotting on a treadmill or across a little force plate or a little straight line in a lab, so to speak. So an alternative to this, and this is goes for any gear and anything you're trying to evaluate, is getting a slow motion video. Now if you have a phone like an iPhone or an Android or whatever, and it has a slow motion capability on the camera, um, set the camera up. Don't hold it in your hand because you'll get a lot of variation. Put it on a tripod or something that stabilizes it. Have the dog do the thing. One is just trotting back and forth in front of you or walking back and forth in a straight line in front of you, and get that in slow motion. And a user tip here is most of these phone cameras take about 4 to 5 seconds to kick in the slow motion. So start the camera rolling, wait about 5 seconds, then have the dog do his thing. Get that in slow motion, compare it wearing the equipment and not wearing the equipment, and you can usually get a pretty good sort of a poor veterinarian's uh, field expedient motion capture analysis from that. This goes with any gear. It goes with muzzles, goes with bite work. If the dog isn't biting right, get a slow motion video, close-up video of the dog on the bite, and you can see things like repeatedly grabbing the bite, letting go, grabbing on the other side, and help you kind of narrow down what's bugging the dog. What's the dog doing consistently that you can say is an effect of whatever it is that you're looking at. All right, so moving on from that, and then constantly evaluate the dog for pain and soreness, or like hair breakage. The rub, like the harness rub on pressure points like the shoulders and under the belly and across the ribs and things, the lower part of the neck. And that'll tell you if the harness is wearing, tearing. You can press on that, see if the dog reacts negatively to that, and then you can evaluate whether that gear fits or needs to be adjusted, or you need to try something else. Now let's move on to body armor. The main function, as we all know, is to protect the dog against penetrating and blunt force trauma, and there's been a handful of cases recently where we've seen that the body armor did work and protect the dog from serious injury, which is really good to hear. The levels of protection are listed similar or labeled similar to humans, like the 2A, 2, 3A, 3, and 4. There is some level 4 listed or labeled body armor for dogs. But that's extrapolated from human body armor testing. And there's no evaluation on actual dogs, and there's no quality control amongst manufacturers. There's no oversight on the canine products like there is on human products. Now, that's not to say that anybody's out there doing bad things with this product or misrepresenting their product. Most of it seems to be pretty good. But what it means is that they could use materials that aren't suitable, or they could label it however they want. Now, typically what they'll do is they'll see what the material is that's used in that level of body armor for humans, and if they make or use that material to make body armor for dogs, they'll label it similarly, because in theory that should work, right? But there's no oversight that says they can't buy materials that were rejected for some reason from use in humans, or leftover materials or something else. There's no oversight to prevent them from using standard materials or labeling it in a way that's misrepresenting what it really is. Now, again, I don't know any company that's actually doing that, but especially the legit companies that we work with all the time in the canine industry. But there could be manufacturers elsewhere that are working out of a factory or a garage or whatever, and there's no one to oversee that, selling it to dogs. So another important fact about body armor is that it typically weighs between 5 to 10 pounds depending on the brand and the style, whether it has ceramic plates in it, which is pretty rare for canine body armor, but there are some companies that make it with the level 4 with the ceramic plates. But even the ones that are the other materials like Kevlar
bullet resistant / resistant materials. They weigh between 5 and 10 pounds, and that can be about 10% of the dog's body weight, depending on how big the dog is. Now, when humans wear body armor, the force of that weight as we run or jump or just stand is coming sort of in a straight line down through our pelvis. It's our chest to our pelvis, to our upper legs, our knees, lower legs, ankles, and then our feet. And we can distribute that pretty well along that axis. Now, dogs, when the way they stand, their quadruped stance, a lot of that weight of the body armor is not supported by the limbs. Some of it is, or quite a bit of it is, by the front limbs, but none of it, essentially, by the back limbs. It's supported by the spine and the rib cage. And that's a quite different dynamic than with people. Now, we don't really know the long-term results of that because most dogs don't wear body armor long-term, and there's never been any study on the long-term effect of wearing body armor in dogs. There have been several studies that, most of them sort of either military studies that don't get published publicly, or they're thesis papers for graduate studies. Again, it's available publicly, and it is evaluated by a panel or a jury, but it's not peer-reviewed and published in regular sources. But the research is still pretty solid, just evaluating their methods, where most of that research has been on the effects of body armor on body temperature, because that's long been a concern about using it in dogs, is it can cause them to overheat. Going back to the weight, though, it's distributed over the spine and the rib cage, and anecdotally, through years of experience, and also through that one study where they were running the dogs on the treadmill, looking at the effects of muzzles and vests and body armor. The dogs that were wearing the ceramic plate style body armor, the level 4 body armor, got kind of sore on their shoulders. Now you can see in this picture here, that plate right there, or that green spot, represents where the ceramic plate actually is in that vest, which it's really on a very small area of the dog. The one important thing is the heart, which is right below the dog's elbow on the chest. You can see that part isn't covered at all. None of the Kevlar material or the other bullet resistant material or the ceramic plate, none of that protects the heart from the front, the bottom, or the sides. And the reason is not to do with the heart so much as just doing the motion of the elbow. That you can see that vest has to have a pretty significant cutout behind the elbow for the elbow to move freely. And that limits where the ceramic plate can be. It's just these really small areas on the side of the dog. Now, if we translate that to that schematic of the organs of the dog, it really only protects a very small part of the dog from over the liver, the stomach, parts of the lung, the gallbladder, and parts of the spleen. But that's only if the dog is shot at perpendicular, at a 90-degree angle to the body, which we know from the stats is pretty rare. Over 75% of the military and law enforcement dogs that died from gunshot wounds, and as shown in a couple different studies, would have not been protected by the current makes of body armor. And now that's not this one specifically. This is just showing the ceramic plate body armor, or at least one brand of it. The body armor that covers more of the body, like that was shown in the previous slide, that protects a lot more of the dog. But 75% or over 75% of these dogs were shot from the front, like a 45-degree angle from the front or 45-degree angle from the back. And that's just because that's the sort of the orientation typically of the bad guy, the dog engaging the bad guy, and the good guys behind the dog. And they're all sort of facing each other. So that's a typical pattern. It doesn't mean that it's always that way, but that is a typical pattern. And a lot of the fatal gunshot wounds in law enforcement and military dogs have been to the head and neck, or the front of the chest. And even if they have that little tiny chest plate that a lot of the body armor has, it still doesn't protect the shoulder area, the neck area very well at all. Now, if 75% of the dogs died, wouldn't have been protected by body armor, that also infers that 20 to 25% of them may have been protected if they were wearing body armor. We really don't know that. But what we do know is recently, just over the last year or two, there's been a handful of cases that have popped up of dogs that have been protected, or at least that they think that their lives were saved because they were wearing body armor. And in the past, that just wasn't very common. It happened every couple years, but maybe it's more common because more people are engaging their dog with body armor on. It's hard to tell, but we do know that some dogs are saved, and if 75% or more wouldn't have been protected, that means 20 to 25% of them may have been protected. So we really can't tell whether that's true or not, or what the, we know it's true. We can't really tell. So how does body armor affect performance? We do know from the scientific evidence that body armor of all types reduces speed and restricts agility in working dogs. And this is shown in a couple different studies, including one really good study by uh, Sarah Stoshi Sherman, I hope I pronounced that right, where she not only looked at the effects of thermoregulation, or effects of body armor on body temperature, which showed no increase in body temperature when wearing level 2 body armor. Also, she looked at the speed and agility with and without body armor. And then finally, she looked at the injury under body armor in canine cadaveric specimens. So they had the material used to make the body armor, not the body armor itself, that was placed in a ballistics lab, placed over cadaveric specimens that had strain gauges and other apparatus applied to them. And then they shot it and determined the extent of injury that occurred regardless of the body armor, which was pretty significant, and also the amount of force, pressure that blunt trauma of the bullet on the body armor caused. So what they did find was that the body armor was protective from penetrating injury, but in many of the dogs up to a certain weight, so sort of like medium-sized dogs, 70-pound dogs and below, had significant fractured ribs and what would have probably been internal hemorrhage and internal contusions had they been alive. And then the dogs that were larger, it seemed to disperse the energy a little bit more, and it wasn't that under the body armor injury wasn't quite as serious. But that's the level 2 body armor, which is not really, it's still kind of common in dogs, not really that common in human body armor anymore. Most people are using at least a level 3A or level 3. But that was a level 2 body armor and showed that. So what she did in these videos here, these next videos, you're going to see is a dog doing apprehension problem, and it's the same dog, and it's the videos are overlapped. So in one of the layers of this video, the dog doesn't have body armor, and another layer, he does have body armor, and you're going to see the difference in the speed that he goes up to the apprehension and sort of like the height at which he jumps to grab the decoy. Now, just in case you're wondering, and I know some people will be, did they first do it without body armor and then they did it with body armor so they were already a little tired, or what happened there? Well, it was a large number of dogs, and they randomized the dogs into what group they were in. Did they start with the body armor or did they start without body armor? And that gives a better scientific average, so to speak, of the final performance. So some dogs might have been a little bit tired when they were wearing the body armor because that was their second go at it, but the other half of the dogs that wearing the body armor was their first go at it, and therefore that tiredness effect is negated. So here's the first one. You can see in the when he's wearing body armor, he has the yellow panel on his back. Now, there was a difference in where the decoy was standing from one trial to the other, but that really isn't what the point of this is. How much slower, how farther behind he was when he was wearing body armor. Now, it was really only a fraction of a second behind, maybe a second behind. Now, is that second that important? And that's up to you to decide, or you to know which experiences your dog or environments your dog is in, whether that second of difference is going to make a difference. In some cases it will, and in some cases it won't. But that's just to show you what the difference was. Now in the second one, the dog's doing agility. Same thing. When he's wearing the yellow panel, that's when he has the body armor on. And you can see, although the dog can make the obstacles, he's slower at it. Now, imagine if that body armor is, let's take a middle ground and say 7 pounds for that body armor. When the dog jumps up, it's going to take more energy to jump up, obviously. but the impact on his joints and his bones is also going to be greater when he lands. If you add 10% of the dog's body weight, and that, think of if you are a 200-pound person and you hold a 200-pound weight, or you carry 200 pounds extra, I'm sorry, 20 pounds extra, 10% of your body weight, you're going to feel that impact as you go up and down. It's going to throw your body off as far as the the stride and where you land and how far you go, just for momentum from that. But is that enough to actually affect the dogs long term? We don't know that. Nobody's ever studied that, and I would really like to see somebody study that. What a great project for a sports medicine resident or somebody, sports medicine enthusiast, orthopedist. That would be a really good project to see. What is the long-term effect of wearing body armor? You could compare dogs that wear body armor, a certain percentage of their training or working, to compare them to dogs who don't wear body armor, and see if overall there's any increased incidence of, or not incidence, but prevalence of joint injury or musculoskeletal injury. Even though some of the bigger brands that we all know use similar materials that are used in production of protective eyewear for humans, it's never really been studied in dogs. But we can extrapolate, because they're using this good material that is shown to block UV light, and we do know that UV light can have effects on dogs. Then it's probably safe to say that it is protecting against some UV light effects with dogs. But it's just not been studied in dogs. Now, it's often recommended for dogs with pannus, as I mentioned. But here's the thing with that is, when I buy sunglasses, I don't buy expensive sunglasses because I'll probably just break them or lose them or something. I buy these cheap sunglasses in gas stations, and they, sometimes they say they have UV protection, but they probably really don't have that much. Sometimes after a while, the coating, the tinted coating, actually wears off. It's just like a film that's over the top of it. Well, do they make me more comfortable when I'm outside? Yes. Can I see better and function better when I'm outside because some of that glare and light is blocked? Yes. Is it really protecting me against the effects of UV light? I don't know. Probably not. But what I'm saying there is that any protection is probably better than no protection. So I still would recommend one of the reputable brands that we know is using the really good materials, because you could go online and all the pet sites, all these knockoff sites, all these crazy sites that are that you've never heard of before. If you just do a search on the internet for canine protective eyewear, you're going to get all sorts of crazy sites that are selling it. Now, there's quality issues. Is it going to break? Is it going to fit? All of that. So when we do recommend something, we say, go ahead and try those other brands if you want. But if you want something to work, if you want something that is probably doing what it says it's doing, the sort of the big brands that everybody knows is probably the way to go. All right. The fit is typically based on the lens length or width from side to side, and then also adjusted with head straps. And there's the single lens style that you can see there. Certain brands have that, the rec specs, and then that off photoshopped or edited brand on the right. The single lens might be better as far as ensuring fit. There's the doggles, which is sort of the standard, the first ones. I do remember having some trouble on some like wide-headed dogs or thin-headed dogs, that getting the proportion of the difference between the lenses sometimes was hard to fit, but we could usually make it work. And the newer ones, that they're adjustable, they're pretty good. It just depends on what is best fit for your dogs. But both of those brands have been around for a long time, and I would really like to see an ophthalmologist or somebody out there doing some kind of long-term study in dogs when they're wearing the goggles or not wearing the goggles, and just see what we're finding as trends as far as prevalence of different kinds of eye conditions or eye injuries. That would be a great and probably fairly simple study to do. We'd love to see it. Right now, there's really nothing out there, no evidence. It's all extrapolated from humans. Another area of protection in working dogs that's becoming more common and more known lately is ear protection. So there is ongoing research on hearing loss and hearing protection in working dogs, but it's military research, so we don't, as a civilian community, doesn't really always get that information in a timely manner. Do a typically there's a research project that goes on this year, and by next year it's published somewhere, if it's not like a long-term project. But in the military, the product or the deliverable isn't always a report for the scientific literature. Often it's to go back to the military, the stakeholder, so to speak. And so we don't always get to see that data. But we do know that this research is ongoing, and I participated with it when I was still in the military. And we know that the early results show temporary hearing loss after loud noise exposure, and that ear protection might help. So dogs flying in helicopters that were tested beforehand, and then at 30 and 60 minutes after flying in the helicopter for a certain amount of time, they did show a reduction in hearing that was temporary. And by 60 minutes, at 30 minutes, there was a significant hearing loss. By 60 minutes, the that had already started to improve back towards baseline. So similar, you just go out to a concert and you stand too close to the speakers, or you're in a very, very loud environment, your ears ring for a while, you have a temporary hearing loss, and it goes back to normal. But we do know that over long term, that can be detrimental and lead to permanent hearing loss. Most of the products that are out there aren't actually tested for their protective effects on dogs, meaning we get a bunch of dogs that we have hearing protection on some of them and no hearing protection on others. You get a baseline, you get after exposure levels. That doesn't really happen a lot. They're working on that with the military studies, but we don't have any evidence right now. And most of the products out there are either extrapolated from humans again, like we know that this foam is noise absorbing, or we know that this sort of acoustic dampening effect from headphones works on humans. Let's apply it to dogs. And it should work. It should, but we don't really know for certain if it does or not. So the product itself is made like the human product based on what we do know is protective, and then it's applied to dogs, hoping that that is also protective. And and it might be some anecdotal evidence shows dogs that wore the hearing protection during these loud noise exposures, very, very small numbers of dogs, they had less of a hearing loss following these exposures if they were wearing the protective devices. So um, lots of potential there, and it's ongoing. And hopefully, some of this information will be released in the civilian literature soon, so we can have a better idea. But if you do search, we have listed some references. If you do search, there's some preliminary reports and some sort of product evaluation reports that are available online out there on the internet that you can read. And the science is pretty sound, even though it hasn't been peer reviewed or published. Just based on what I see about it, it's pretty sound. So, and then there's no evidence yet on the effect on mobility or distraction, other than anecdotal reports. We know that dogs don't like stuff on their head, so they have to be acclimated to it. Some dogs are better than others with that. And there was a study, I think in 1969, that was in the military, but it was published for the public to see. And two very well-meaning veterinarians, or very well-intentioned veterinarians, I should say, came up with an idea to make these custom fitted earplugs for dogs that were working on a flight line in the Air Force, which is great because really loud noises, humans have to wear protective headgear or protective earwear. We know that, or they'll suffer hearing loss. So they designed these earplugs for these dogs, and they were custom fitted, molded into the dog's ear, and custom fitted for every dog. They did a great job with that, and in the end, none of the dogs, or like one of the 10 dogs, or whatever, would tolerate it. They would spend so much time trying to get the stuff out of their ear that they wouldn't actually do their job. So, that's a practical lessons learned right there. And the thing about that study, and good on them for doing it, because that showed a lot of initiative from them to study that in the first place. But one of the things that they weren't able to show, or they didn't study, is at that time, 1969, when they did that study of those earplugs, they didn't have a baseline. What is the problem? And before we do any studies on gear, we should know the operational need. How bad is the problem? And that's what the ongoing military research is doing right now. First, just trying to categorize how much hearing loss is going on in dogs, and does that actually cause an operational problem? Are the dogs uh, so detrimented by that hearing loss that it makes them ineffective at their work, or it decreases their ability to work? That's what they're trying to sort out now, at the same time coming up with potential protective gear that that can be applied to the dogs. As I mentioned in that first slide or in the intro, a bad thing that happens or an unwanted effect is that we often extrapolate a problem from the human tactical environment, and without evaluating how bad the problem is with dogs, we start developing potential solutions for that problem without knowing if it's a problem in dogs at all, or to what degree the problem is. And the finding the baseline, um, evaluating and assessing and describing what the actual problem is really should come first, and then the operational need. Here's the problem. How does that affect us in operations? Does it? If it doesn't, move on or pick something else to study, or just keep it in the back of your mind as a gee whiz. If it does affect operations or affect the health and well-being of the dogs, or the operational capability of the dogs, then let's get down to brass tacks and study it a lot harder. And then once we define what the problem is, then let's start working on solutions. Or at least some of those things can be simultaneous, but don't develop the solution without really knowing what the problem is. And in that case, 1969, that's kind of what happened. But given the state of the veterinary officers in the military at the time that didn't do a lot of research like that, I'm pretty proud that they did that research and kind of paved the way for others in the future, even if they just didn't have the resources at the time to evaluate the problem. And I don't even think hearing testing for dogs was available back then, so defining that problem would have been a lot harder. So the next thing is paws. Now, paw injuries in general are probably the most common injury overall in working dogs. Like I've said many times in other presentations, heat injury is the number one killer of working dogs overall, but paw pad injuries are probably the most common injury, and rarely ever fatal, if ever. But they can be a mission stopper. If the dog is sore, has got a really badly injured paw or an abrasion, it's not only maybe not ethical to have the dog work, but the dog just doesn't want to work because they're really sore and they're limping, distracted by their paw. So as minor as these injuries are from the dog's health standpoint, it can take the dog down for several weeks while you're trying to get it healed, and it can be a mission stopper when you're actually out in the field doing your work. So paw protection, the main function is just to protect the paws against physical and especially thermal injury or cold injury. So sled dogs, we know, wear booties like they're seen in the picture on the far right. Some of the Iditarod dogs, for example, or the Yukon Quest dogs run 1,000 miles in a course of 8 to 10 days. And ice is not only cold, but it's like little shards of glass, and it can be really damaging to the paws. And the mushers take excellent care. They're the masters of paw care in dogs for sure. And they wear these little Cordura booties that don't really have very much grip strength if you're walking on a solid surface, but since they're in the snow, it usually tends to have a good grip. But the main thing is they keep the paws just a little bit warmer, and they protect against the abrasion from the ice and a little bit from the cold. There's other kinds of footwear, like the one in the middle there. That one is advertised as being good for grip strength or for traction. They're a little bit heavy, a little bit clunky. They've got, they're made basically like human shoes, little Velcro straps there to keep them on the dog's paw. And they're really, really tough and durable. We've used a lot of those boots for medical reasons. Like you got a dog with a paw pad injury, you put that on there. And as long as you can keep the dog from pulling it off with their teeth, they're really durable as far as they're not going to break down, just like maybe a bandage would. And another style is the moccasin style, like you see over in the left. We did use those on a lot of dogs in Afghanistan and Iraq, and they seem pretty good. Easy to take on and off. They're really super lightweight. They didn't cause the booty dance, so to speak, quite as much as the bigger, heavier ones did. And they didn't tend to get warm like those black rubber ones did. They didn't tend to sort of soak up the thermal the solar radiation or the heat from the ground. So those are pretty good, pretty lightweight. They're pretty durable. They last for a while if the dog's not wearing them all the time, obviously, but if they're wearing them when it's really hot outside, or really cold on the ground, they're pretty durable. And there's all sorts of different kinds. For paw protection, sometimes we would just take a piece of elastic-on tape, that really super sticky surgical bandage tape, and we'd put it from the middle of the dog's paw all around down below on the great paw pad, back up to the middle, but wouldn't overlap the edges so the paw could still expand. And so sort of like from the second metatarsal, second toe, all the way around across the great paw pad and to the fourth metatarsal, leaving a toe or two between so that the foot could still expand, because the stuff's a little stretchy but not really stretchy. And that stuff is great, durable. It'd stay on for a long time. It was great against abrasive surfaces. The only problem with that is we didn't like it in really super hot weather, because the glue of it would melt and it would sort of burn the dogs or cause the dogs discomfort. So, but that's another option as well. And secondary function is that they could protect against chemical and biological hazard. If you have to send the dog in somewhere that's potentially contaminated, then you can just remove them and wash them, or remove them and throw them away. We do know that the search and rescue community isn't really that thrilled about booties, because they feel that the dogs can't grip on rubble quite as well. But then other people in wilderness situations where that's not as quite as big as a problem, they tend to like them. The bottom line of that, though, is to have your dog acclimated to them before you go to use them. They do change the pressure and load of the foot strike on the ground. There's evidence to show that in the immediate as they're using them. It does change the angle of the foot strike. It does change the angle of the force that's coming down through the leg, and that potentially could have long-term effects on the musculoskeletal system, or could cause misstep as they're moving. But there's no evidence so far on the long-term musculoskeletal effects, and that's simply because nobody's studied it. Comparing dogs that were wearing them to dogs that didn't wear them through their life, and what were the long-term effects. Or maybe in sort of a mission set, like dogs on a deployment over a certain period of time, if they wore them or not wore them, how many dogs got paw injury or foot injury and how many dogs didn't, and compare those over that short period of time. But nobody's ever done that, so we don't know. There is anecdotal evidence, lots of anecdotal evidence, that it protects them from thermal injury on hot surfaces. The dog's really, really uncomfortable. You put booties on them, they're not as uncomfortable anymore, and they go back to work. That's pretty solid anecdotal evidence that they're more comfortable when they have them on a hot surface or cold surface. And the the practical application, though, there's the booty dance and the fact that they get really distracted. So prior acclimation, we all know that is a key. This is a great video. It's been around for a long time.
That's about as good as I'm going to get. Free dog. Come on. Let's go.
Good dog, Yari. Good dog, Yari.
Come on, let's go. Let's go.
Good dog.
Good
dog.
Come on, buddy. Come on, Yari. Come on. Come on, Yari. Yep. Yep.
There you go, Rich.
He's not over there.
And that right there, when he throws him the toy to distract him, that's key. And you do get something that the dog likes better than the worry about the boots. And with proper acclimation and use, the dog will figure it out after a while. But in this case, it's not only changing the stride of the dog from a behavioral standpoint. The dog is like, "What is on my paws?" But going back to that evidence that of doing motion capture and gait analysis, force plate analysis on dogs wearing boots, there is a difference in how their foot strikes the ground. And is it because of the weight, or is it because of the behavioral aspect of the dog is lifting their legs higher in response to having that perceived extra weight on their paw, or that thing on their paw that's bugging them? They didn't really go into detail on that. All they said in the end was that the dogs definitely had a different foot strike and force on the ground when they were wearing boots compared to when they weren't wearing boots. And like I said before, we don't have any evidence on long-term musculoskeletal effects. But in the long run, dogs using booties is probably a pretty safe thing as long as they're acclimated and it doesn't affect their ability to grip the ground. One sort of general category of equipment is what I'd call vest carried equipment. So anything that's carried on the vest or the harness or body carried equipment. And the main function seems to be to carry cameras, which are used quite a bit now. In some cases, first aid supplies or other things. If you just got the dog that you're taking backpacking, sometimes you make the dog carry their own water or their own food or whatever. But from a tactical standpoint, typically cameras and some other directional gear or mission enhancing sort of gear. There aren't any specific studies on the effects on performance or health of vest carried equipment. But if we extrapolate that, and I use that word a lot, but if we extrapolate that from the fact that take off the equipment and you just have the vest or the harness, and we have documented range of motion issues and impact issues, impact the force of the limbs hitting the ground and alterations in gait, and we have that from harnesses and vests already, now add the additional weight that might have sort of a fulcrum effect, pulling the dog off, if it gets off balance or something. And we really haven't seen, even anecdotally, I haven't seen a lot of musculoskeletal injuries or any musculoskeletal injuries that I think have resulted from the dog becoming off balance. But there's a lot of anecdotal incidents reported of the equipment getting stuck on stuff like doorways, knocking the dog sideways because he gets part of that bulky gear stuck on a fence or window or doorway or something like that. And there's a couple of cases where this equipment, especially metal equipment like cameras or other directional devices or whatever, that bullets or shrapnel has actually embedded in the equipment, potentially saving the dog's life, which is kind of cool, even though that's not the function for it at all. It's just kind of knowing that if you have a piece of metal that gets hit or blown up, hit by something ballistic at a very high speed, is that metal thing now going to shatter and also cause further damage? And so far, not really a lot of evidence for that, but we do have a lot of anecdotal evidence and experience of just seeing dogs get stuck because of this extra gear they're carrying. Doesn't seem to be causing too much of a operational problem, and a lot of the gear is so streamlined now compared to what it was 10, 15 years ago, that it's not as big of a problem, but it's still something to consider. So what's the evidence? Just fall back on the evidence from wearing a vest or a harness at all, and we know that it does restrict their movement and can cause some soreness when they have larger items placed on it. Now you place another item on that, that's only going to exacerbate that a little bit. But to what degree, we just don't know. So here's another concept I think is really important to talk about, especially for veterinary personnel that work with working dogs. So e-collar lesions, this is not an endorsement for or against e-collars or their use. I think that people that are well trained in it, they can use it appropriately and it's an effective tool. People that aren't well trained in it or have really bad timing, it's not an effective tool. It could be a dangerous tool. It just depends on if you know how to use it or not. But aside from that, that's not the point here. The point is that these lesions that are directly caused by an e-collar, it's not quite what we call pathognomonic, meaning if you see this sign, this is the only thing it could be, but it's almost. If I see this lesion on a dog, I know what it's caused from, or typically know what it's caused from. So it's important to know, though, that it's not related to inappropriate use of these devices. This is a contact dermatitis that might be related to the metal coating on the device. It also, it's slightly irritating to the dog when it's used appropriately. It's supposed to irritate the dog a little bit. That causes an itch along with the contact dermatitis, and then they self-traumatize and scratch. The next thing you know, the dog presents with a tiny little lesion, like a quarter to dollar size, silver dollar size lesion. They bring them into the vet. The vet clips and cleans it, as we do. We clip all the fur off, and we see this big mess underneath there. And we freak the heck out. So the first thing, vets, don't freak out. Nobody's abusing this dog. Dogs can get this simply from a contact dermatitis or sensitivity to the actual physical device itself, and then they self-traumatize. I've also seen this with certain kinds of collars, like cheap collars that have certain nickel or zinc coatings on them that maybe aren't as great as other collars, or they actually, sometimes you have the really, really shiny collars. Sometimes you feel that metal and it's a little bit more abrasive. I've seen this with other types of metal as well, but very, very common to see it with, oh no, I shouldn't say it's very common. If you see this lesion, it's very common that the cause is an e-collar. So definitely take that history. Don't freak out. Don't accuse them of abusing the dog. That's not going to go well. It's a contact dermatitis, just bad luck for that dog. And it seems to be related to whether the fur was wet when the dog had the collar on. So get that as part of the history as well. And then it's followed by self-trauma. The great news is, where 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we used to freak out and think these were burns because that's what we thought was happening. And we treat them like burns with antibiotics and burn creams and all this stuff. Turns out, no, it's just a really nasty hot spot. Clip the fur away from it to let it dry out and not accumulate that gunk in the fur. Maybe a saline rinse once or twice a day for a couple days, just saline out of an IV bag or sterile saline. That helps it heal, and it's going to heal well on its own after a couple days just by clipping and cleaning it and keeping it clean. Now, if you see a really bad one, you could put the dog on cephalexin or a broad spectrum antibiotic that's really good for hot spots. I wouldn't recommend using steroids or anything else. This is going to heal pretty well on its own. The important thing is don't freak out about it. Don't accuse them of abuse. It's not how they used it. It's just the fact that the dog was sensitive to the metals or materials that are used, and then followed with self-trauma. So here's an interesting topic, and we just started working with some different people on this concept as far as research goes. But what are the behavioral effects of tactical gear? A lot of people say, when they put their muzzle on their dog, the dog knows it's go time, it's ready, it's time to work. So that kind of causes a dilemma in the veterinary clinic where you put the muzzle on the dog because you don't want anybody to get bitten, and you want the vets to feel safe, and they want to feel safe. But that's also a signal to some dogs that it's time to go bite somebody. So, or potentially bite somebody. Let's get to work. So that's kind of a dilemma, and there's no right or wrong answer with that. It's just an interesting concept that the equipment that you use is a cue to what's going to happen next. And most of us know this. If you have dogs in your house, you pick up the leash, your dog goes ape because they know they're going to go out for a walk. A lot of dogs with separation anxiety, you pick up your keys, you put on your jacket, you grab your briefcase or your backpack or whatever you take to work. Dog goes nuts, starts tearing everything up, or starts whining, following you around, being really clingy. You've cued them, by your behavior, you've cued them that something is about to happen, something either negative or positive is about to happen. So it's kind of interesting what the behavioral effects of the gear are. We've already seen lots of studies on the effects of anticipation of work on thermoregulation, and in most of the studies that looked at it, dogs watching other dogs work, or dogs seeing cues that they might go to work pretty soon, started to get kind of agitated and excited, and their body temperature went up. And so in this case, there's a great video. This is a young dog, and she's getting dressed up to go to school, and she's watching, somebody's picked up the bite suit from a truck, and they're carrying it across this area to go to training, and she's just losing her little mind. And as we did this video for our heat injury webinar, heat injury research, and this dog's temperature was about almost 106 just from freaking out, knowing that's the thing I get to bite, and they're getting me dressed up, and she doesn't want to put on her little outfit. She wants to go bite something, and she's watching the guy carry the bite suit across the yard. So just a fun video showing that effect of anticipation. The dog's getting all sorts of cues: the bite suit, the tactical vest, all of that. Everybody's standing around looking like a posture of there. It only got worse when the guy was actually going to put on the bite suit and go inside and hide inside of a building. And so the whole scenario was just making the dog lose her mind, because she knew that all the fun stuff was about to happen. So that's a new area. in research that's just now being explored, and we're really excited about it. So here's the list of references. We've got everything in the order that we talked about it: the muzzles, the tactical vests, the non-ballistic vests, harnesses, body armor, ear protection, paw protection, the cameras and load carrying equipment. And wherever there was evidence, scientific evidence, we put it in here for you to be able to learn more about it. A lot of these cases, as we mentioned, there's just no evidence out there right now. And we really hope that we're able to research it further, or other people are able to research this further, and especially the military and law enforcement side of it, so we can get you the most accurate information about this equipment. So if you have any questions at all, you can contact us at contact@vettachgroup.com and ask your questions regarding this webinar, or give us your comments. We'd really like to hear them. And we hope you enjoyed this webinar and you got something interesting out of it. And please feel free to contact us with what you'd like to hear in the future. Thanks so much.